Ladies and gentlemen, and as well, welcome to the young Canadians who are joining our tables. You'll notice that there are people who are younger than you at your luncheon table today, and we're very pleased to offer them the opportunity to hear such a speaker as Phil Fontaine. So welcome to everyone. My name is Susan Letson, and I am the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, or as we call it, CCEPA. We're delighted to welcome you to the CCEPA annual lecture, this year given by Mr. Phil Fontaine, who will speak about ethical relations with First Nations in Canada. CCEPA was founded by the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University with a mandate to provide an arena for critical thinking, public discussion, and research into current ethical challenges facing our society. CCEPA delivers public programming, funds ethical research, and offers assistance to organizations looking to create ethical guidelines. On your tables, you will find a flyer listing our upcoming events, such as Impact Investing on March 19th and the Body as Canvas on April 4th, and an evaluation form. Please take the time after our luncheon speaker this afternoon to give us your thoughts on today's events. The work of CCEPA depends on the support of public and private organizations and individuals. RBC is one of our valued supporters, and it is with their assistance that we're able to bring you such a widely respected and recognized speaker as Mr. Phil Fontaine. It is my pleasure to hand over the podium to Ms. Kim Mason, President, Atlantic Region for RBC, to introduce Mr. Fontaine, who will then speak to us for about 45 minutes while you enjoy your lunch. Dr. Jody Clark, Academic Dean at the Atlantic School of Theology and a CCEPA board member, will be making his closing remarks shortly before 1 o'clock. Thank you for coming. Enjoy your lunch, and please welcome Kim Mason.
Thank you very much, Susan, and I think we're into afternoon, so I'll say good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to be with you today for what is sure to be an insightful and stimulating presentation by one of Canada's foremost experts in Aboriginal affairs. And I know Phil has been very busy since he first arrived here, and a dinner last night and a breakfast this morning and now lunch. So I can assure you he's leaving well fed and leaving us well informed, so thank you very much for that. Aboriginal peoples have a proud history of engaging the talents of community members and fostering a culture of partnerships for the future. And nowhere is that more evident than here in Nova Scotia. RBC is committed to serving Aboriginal governments, communities, organizations, businesses, and individuals. We believe in the importance of addressing issues and opportunities that are important not only to Aboriginal peoples, but to all Canadians. These include access to banking and capital, community and social development, employment, training and education, and procurement. We also believe in the power of leveraging diversity for growth and innovation. Understanding and drawing on diversity requires fully engaging the talents of all people to reflect and address the needs of the communities they serve. This is why RBC continues to partner with Aboriginal communities through relationships built on understanding, trust, and respect to assist in the journey towards economic prosperity and sustainability. To that effect, we are very proud to have built a relationship with today's guest speaker, who acts as a special advisor to RBC, providing advice and counsel to our Canadian businesses to help us deepen our relationship with Aboriginal communities, governments, and businesses across the country. And while Phil may not know this, I've been on the receiving end of some of those conversations, and they have always been extremely beneficial to us within our organization. We have benefited from his wisdom and expertise gained from a tremendous career as a leader within Canada's First Nations communities. To say that Phil Fontaine is a dedicated and highly respected figure in Canada is perhaps a bit of an understatement. He has been instrumental in facilitating change and advancement for First Nations people from the time he was first elected to public office as chief at the young age of 28. He is a proud member of the Scotian First Nation in Manitoba and still plays an active role in support of his community today. In the early 1980s, he was elected to the position of Manitoba Regional Chief for the Assembly of First Nations. When his term expired in 1991, he was elected Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, where he served 3 consecutive terms. In 1997, he stepped onto the national stage where he was elected National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations for an unprecedented 3 terms in office. An advocate for human rights and a survivor of residential school abuse, Fontaine's crowning achievement to date is the residential schools settlement. At $5.6 billion in individual compensation, Phil Fontaine negotiated the largest settlement in Canadian history for the largest human rights violation in Canadian history, arising out of the 150-year Indian residential school tragedy. He has received many awards and honors for his work, including the 1996 National Aboriginal Achievement Award for Public Service, 14 honorary degrees, and membership in both the Order of Manitoba and the Order of Canada. Today, he is not only a special advisor to RBC, but founder of the Aboriginal consulting firm Ishkonigan, which he established in 2009 and specializes in consultation and mediation services to Indigenous communities, all levels of government and business. If you've been following the news at all over the past several months, then you certainly understand the Aboriginal community is molding a new agenda in Canada with enhanced focus on opportunities and challenges facing Indigenous people. I can't think of anyone more qualified to speak about the topic at hand today, ethical relations with First Nations. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in welcoming Mr. Phil Fontaine, our guest speaker today.
Thank you so much for such a warm introduction, generous, Kim. And thank you, my friends that are here this afternoon. You've taken time out from your extremely busy schedules to join in this conversation that we will have this afternoon. But before I begin my presentation, I want to acknowledge the traditional lands that we are on here, that we are gathered today, the Mi'kmaq, the Maliseet, and the Passamaquoddy, because if it wasn't for their generosity, we wouldn't be here today. So I believe it's really very important for all of us to acknowledge those very kind and generous people. Thank you. We apparently have a way with words. When I say we, I'm referring to my family, the Fontaines in Saguin. And we represent a pretty unique family. Our thought processes sometimes are different and unique. And indeed, the way we express ourselves is sometimes pretty interesting. And we have a tendency to mangle words, and the thoughts don't come out as they're supposed to. And I'm probably the most guilty of Fontaine individuals, but there's some that are pretty unique. And we have a relative that has an interesting way of expressing himself. For example, he'd say, you know, if there's trouble out there, we're just going to have to circle the trailers. And, you know, he lives out in the country. And so you can't pull the mud over that guy's eyes ever. Or he'd say from a couple different ways of expressing it. He'd say, that guy's not the smartest pencil in the drawer. Or he's not the brightest pencil in the drawer. And just very unique and genuine. And so this afternoon I want to be consistent with family tradition and present you what I consider to be a true reflection of Canada, at least from my own unique perspective. And what I have to say this afternoon is meant to be kind. It isn't meant to be hurtful in any way to anyone. Because I recognize and appreciate that for every person here, each of you represents a unique perspective, history, your family values, your traditions, and each of those is incredibly important. And one is not less than the other. It really adds to this beautiful mix that is in this room and beyond, and in every part of the country. And indeed, I see as one of the most important challenge that is before us, especially if we believe in doing right by all peoples, being fair and just to all peoples, making sure that every opportunity is afforded every person to be able to achieve his or her dreams, to live their dreams. And one of the impediments that's been before us for too long is that we just don't know our history. We don't have an appreciation of Canadian history. We don't have an appreciation or an understanding, indeed too often an unwillingness to learn about others. And there's been a very important missing chapter in the history that most of us know, and especially public address systems that sometimes interfere with our conversation. And as I was saying, there's a very important missing chapter. And the absence of that understanding and perspective from our collective thinking represents a problem, at least in terms of being fair and just to all. And the missing chapter I refer to is about Aboriginal people, the First Nations, that have been here not for a mere 500 years, but for thousands upon thousands of years. And this was the homeland of so many diverse and distinct Indigenous peoples. And we lived, we thrived, we flourished, we fought, right? And from time to time we were unfair to others weaker than us. Right? But this was our homeland. This was where we'd been for a long time. And then in a few short 500 years, that part of our collective history was essentially wiped out, right? Dismissed as inconsequential, as unimportant. And the fact that we've dismissed that part of our history, our collective history, has weakened the nation, has impoverished Canada, and indeed has made it very, very difficult for this country to achieve true justice for all of its citizens. And so I would urge all of you in this room, and indeed your families, your friends, even your enemies, to begin to understand and appreciate their country better than they do. And the most important step that one can take in this process of understanding and knowing and becoming sensitized is to learn about their brothers and sisters, the Indigenous peoples. It'll make you healthier. It'll bring peace within you. It will give you the kind of energy that you need, that one needs in the fight for justice. I am convinced that you will be inspired to do right for all. And that's, I thought it was important enough that I make that point, before I begin the main part of my presentation, which is ethics and First Nations. So I want to thank Canadian Centre Ethics in Public Affairs for your very kind invitation to me to be here with you this afternoon. And of course, Royal Bank for being such an important sponsor for bringing all of us together here. So I'll speak about ethics. Simply put, ethics is about what is right and what is wrong. Ethics examines the rational justification for our moral judgments. It studies what is morally right or wrong, just or unjust. Ethics examines what is the proper course of action for us to take. So, first, let's start with the description of the situation. To determine what is just or unjust in the circumstances, we need an honest description of the circumstances. Only then can we determine a proper course of action. So, here are some measures of our circumstances, our collective situation. First Nations in Canada, or Aboriginal people, comprise close to 3% of Canada's population. I said 4 this morning over breakfast. So 4 is probably the right answer. However, according to the United Nations, there are 90 times more likely than the rest of Canadians to not have running water or waste disposal systems, sewer services. 1 in 4 First Nation communities currently have drinking water advisories, which means their water is not safe to drink unless it's boiled. 1 in 4. That's about 130 First Nation communities, given that there are 633 First Nation communities from coast to coast to coast. 3 times more First Nations children are being removed from their families today than at the peak of the residential school experience. At the peak of the residential school experience, there are 9,000 First Nations children in about 130 schools, residential schools or boarding schools. Today, there are close to 30,000 First Nations children in state care, which means they're in the care of foster families, been adopted out. They're under the care of First Nation child welfare agencies or provincial child welfare agencies. 30,000. And this isn't a story about lack of parental love. It's really a very direct consequence of poverty, First Nations poverty. Because families simply can't take care of their children. They just can't afford to. So they end up in state care. It's a sad story. It's a sad story. It's our story. According to the former Auditor General, Sheila Fraser, First Nations children are being placed in care at 6 to 8 times the national rate. 6 to 8 times. First Nations suicide rate, one of the highest in the world. One of the highest in the world. And it's certainly the highest in Canada. And it affects most often young men between the ages of 16 to 24. That's where the highest rate of suicide in the First Nation community occurs. But the attempted suicides are significantly higher with women, though they don't complete the action. And the sad story here, or an even sadder story than the number, right, is that the suicide victims are getting younger and younger and younger. And the two youngest on record that I'm aware of are two brothers, 8 and 10 years old. Right? And so that speaks to the despair in too many First Nations families, the sense of hopelessness in many young people, and absolutely unnecessary. It shouldn't be. First Nations people experience 3 to 5 times the rate of serious health issues like diabetes and obesity. Despite being approximately 4% of Canada's population, 23% of the non-Aboriginal population have university degrees. 23, but I thought it was more like 28%. My number is wrong. It's about 28%. But only 9% the Aboriginal population have university degrees. We have in Canada about 55 Indigenous languages. Only 3 of those Indigenous languages remain strong. Inuktitut, that's in the north. Cree, it's spoken throughout the northern part of our country and to the west. And the language I speak, Ojibwe. The 52 other languages are in various stages of disappearing, becoming extinct. And there are some that have already become extinct. And as you know, language is the repository of everything that we are as a peoples. Our traditions, our histories, our ceremonies, our values. And once we lose one language, we face the loss of something really very important. Within families, within communities, but within the country. And here again, it shouldn't be. These languages should be allowed to flourish. They should be a part of our daily lives. According to an AFN study, the Assembly First Nations study, that was conducted when I was National Chief, we pointed out that for every $1 a non-Aboriginal municipality receives to provide basic services to its citizens, First Nations receive just about 50% less. And the primary source of funding for First Nations is one, right, the federal government. Canadian citizens receive services from 3 levels of government: federal, provincial, and municipal. And this is a brief snapshot. I haven't covered jails, I haven't covered housing, I haven't covered the lack of schools in our communities. I haven't talked about that. But this is a snapshot of what it looks like in Canada. This is Canada, a picture of Canada. And included in this, of course, we have millions of acres of treaty land that were promised to us almost 150 years ago. That was promised to us. Think of that concept for a moment. This was our land. Right? We entered into negotiations, treaty negotiations, as sovereign nations. And at the conclusion of the negotiations, the government held all the land. And they ended up promising us our own land. Right? And that is a fact. So today we are owed, as I said, millions of acres. That was never transferred. In my province alone, there were 26 First Nation communities that never received all of the land that they were promised. when we signed the first treaty in Manitoba on August the 3rd, 1871. Treaty number 1 that I belong to. And in those places, right, in the parts of Canada where there are no treaties, people are fighting for their recognition, the fair and just recognition of their inherent right to the land, the inherent right to self-government. And it's been a long, difficult struggle. And included in the right to our land, the right to self-determination, is a right to economy. Right? And that's been absent from many, many First Nation communities. And indeed, to protect the rights of our children, their culture, and their environment. See, what happens is that very often we are forced to go to the courts for a remedy. It shouldn't have to be that way, because if you go to the courts, it's a very expensive process. It's cumbersome, it's slow, and it's very costly. These issues that I talk about, First Nations poverty and all of its manifestations, and the resolution, the fair and just resolution of those issues, is really a political matter. And they should be resolved through an intergovernmental political process, with governments coming to the table to talk, and then at the end of the talk, to resolve, to fix something that may be wrong, or to improve on something that is, that needs government attention. And good for us, because in recent years, we've been winning more than our share of the court cases. Right? Bill Gallagher, former land claims negotiator, a lawyer, has written this book. I think it's called Resource Rulers, where he describes the approximately 150 court decisions that are favorable to First Nations rights and interests in the last number of years. 150. This, in my view, represents not a problem, but a real opportunity for the country to finally fix the problems. In addition, First Nations are subject to the only racially motivated and racially targeted piece of legislation in Canada. This is the only legislation of its kind in the world. I'm referring to the Indian Act. There isn't any legislation anywhere else in the world that speaks to one race, peoples. And during the course of describing the rights and interests, denies the fundamental right to self-rule or self-determination. And the Indian Act is racist, it's archaic, and it should be repealed. And I say this knowing that I will offend people from within my own community that believe that the Indian Act shouldn't be touched, right? Shouldn't be repealed unless and until the federal government comes forward with enabling legislation that clearly recognizes our right to self-rule and sets out what that means in terms of legislation. And the Indian Act was first brought into force in 1876. Right? 1876, that's mere 5 years after we had signed Treaty Number 1. And the treaty-making process ruled out the western provinces and to the north. In fact, some treaties were negotiated before provinces were created. Right? True. And the imposition of the Indian Act was a betrayal. Simply a betrayal. Because certain promises were made, certain rights were to be established, respected, and in fact implemented. Never happened. And it undermined the fundamental structure of the relationship that had been established between Europeans, then eventually Canadians, and the Indigenous peoples. And this was after, well, the Royal Proclamation was in 1763, right? And Treaty Number 1 was 1871. But before even the numbered treaties, there were treaties in Ontario and to the east that are pre-Confederation treaties. Our treaties are post-Confederation. And then we have the modern-day treaties. So the Indian Act then brought forward this strange presence, the Indian agent. We were the only group in Canada that had people that ran our lives completely, made all of the decisions that mattered to us. Anything to do with land, our children, our communities, how we conducted our affairs, controlled by one individual, the Indian agent. I remember, very distinctly remember, when I was elected chief in 1972, we still had an Indian agent. But big change. He had moved from the post office in Pine Falls, the town next to our community, and moved into our band office, right? Our community office. And he had a little office there. And so here I am, young chief, don't know any better or any different, but I would call a council meeting and you would be excluded. Because I thought, hey, this is our business, right? We're going to talk about community matters. And eventually he came to me and he said, Phil, no, he was more respectful. He said, Chief, I think I'm not wanted here. Right? I said, well, you're probably right about that. And he said, well, maybe I should leave. And I said, well, maybe you should. Right? But it was all very respectful. So he packed up and left our band office. And that was the last we ever saw of an Indian agent in my community. And this was just in 1973, 40 years ago. And the Indian agent still had a significant presence in many parts of the country. And interestingly enough, I traveled to South Africa because I had heard that South African officials had come to visit the reserve system. And the rumor had it that when they went back, well, more than a rumor, they actually thanked the federal government for hosting the visit. The system of apartheid then was introduced in South Africa. And we are told that it was based on the reserve system in Canada, the Canadian reserve system. We've never had it absolutely confirmed, but we have it on good source that that's how apartheid came to be. It was based on or modeled on the reserve system. So the kind of complete and overarching power created through the Indian Act paved the way for numerous abuses, including Indian residential school system, which took away innocent children. 150,000, in fact, in the 100 plus years that the residential school experience was a part of Canada. And the Indian residential school system wasn't about the reaffirmation or the affirmation of us as a peoples, because it denied our languages, denied our cultures, our customs, our ceremony. And that's just the way it was, right? And I think you have an idea, because you may have come across this as newsworthy item, that something bad happened in these schools, and innocent children were affected. And I think Kim mentioned that I'm a former residential school student, survivor, 10 years at two schools. I was 6 years old when I entered the first school. Yeah. It is a scary place. And so, you think about this. I was going to say something about forced sterilization of women, but I won't. Or the exclusion of the fundamentals of democracy. Right? I won't say that in any detail, just a reference. So, you ask yourself, you think, I'm sure, gosh, this is a dark picture. Fontaine is painting a very dark picture of Canada, when we know that this is one of the best places in the whole world. And you know, I agree with you. Right? It is dark. And it may be unfair to the country, but I would think that you would agree that it's really a fair description and a fair statement. So, if we're going to truly talk about ethics, about what is right and what is wrong, we need to understand and accept the reality of the situation we're in now and the past that created this situation. That is the only way we can find a truly sustainable path forward, a proper course of action to take. So where can we start to begin an ethical foundation for a path forward? I'm happy to say that we have common ground on this part. The Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people that make up this country, that's it. Dating from hundreds of years ago, Western philosophers like John Locke and others created the theory of natural law, a view that certain rights or values are universally inherent, are not determined by men and cannot be modified by human-made law. Indigenous cultures have a similar idea, but I understand, in fact I learned this, that John Locke actually constructed his arguments to make it possible to have the land grab in the Americas. That's one part of the equation. To us, the Creator imbued us with both rights and responsibilities that we must discharge these rights and responsibilities fairly and honestly. These cannot be modified by humans, but these were granted to us through our families, our clans, our traditions, our ceremonies, and our languages. When we talk about inherent rights, when we say we have inherent rights, we are talking about the rights that were given to us by the Creator. And that cannot be modified by Western legal systems. These rights, like the right to hunt and fish, and to drink safe drinking water, and to have ceremonies, come with sacred responsibilities that we traditionally always fulfilled. Right? And at one time it was against the law to practice the sun dance. Right? The potlatch was outlawed. People were jailed for living their ceremonies. Jailed in Canada. Our ability to fulfill these responsibilities has been dramatically impacted by colonization. But almost all Indigenous communities, in one way or another, are trying to rebuild our ability to fulfill these responsibilities. However, we are trying to do so in 21st century that is so very different, fundamentally different from pre-colonization times. So the fundamental challenge our country faces is to find a way to have our cultures thrive in a very modern, economic, spiritual, and physical sense. Often finding a solution to this challenge is in itself very challenging. Our communities are brimming with frustration. The Idle No More movement is a perfect example of a grassroots movement that expresses Indigenous frustration with Canada's failure to protect land and water. Indigenous communities in Canada have been described as a sleeping giant, and the breadth and depth of the Idle No More movement, which occurred in the dead of winter, should be the harbinger of a message we need to heed. What is this message? The message is that we need to find an immediate and relevant resolution to the circumstances that we are currently in. And I'm hopeful that we can do this if we choose to recognize that we have a common ethical view of our society. We just need to find a way to implement it today. In some senses, the solutions are very simple, in that they only require financial resources, money, cash. These kinds of solutions are related to providing safe drinking water for every community that we have in Canada, and providing enough resources to deliver basic services to First Nations communities and their citizens. Other solutions are more challenging to implement, but are no less necessary. The most important of these is the resolution of our treaties. And by this I mean the final fulfillment of the original treaty promises. First Nations must be given their lands if we are ever to develop First Nation economies that can support our societies and cultures. In the province I come from, Manitoba, as I noted, the transfer of land to fulfill the original treaty promises is being held up by the lack of resources, and this may strike you as simple, to have the land surveyed. We don't have the money to have these lands surveyed, and the obligation doesn't rest on First Nations, on governments, and they haven't provided the land, so the fair and just resolution of this matter is unresolved. This is an unbelievably minor detail in the entire treaty implementation process, and it is shocking that the future First Nation economies is held hostage by something so easily addressed. Finally, I want to present you with a vision that restores a just path for First Nations in Canada. If we are to find an ethical basis for a relationship that meets both of our needs in the long term, we must repeal the Indian Act. We must eliminate the Indian Act, and in its place, deliver a plan that builds a future for our people. This can be done. Really, it can be done. All it needs is the will, the political will of every government in the land. When I was Grand Chief in Manitoba, we created such a plan called the Framework Initiative, FAI, the Framework Agreement Initiative, and is more commonly known as the dismantling of Indian affairs. When I was National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, we worked with the government of the day to develop the Kelowna Accord. Remember the Kelowna Accord, a comprehensive and visionary plan to build education, economic and lands-related strength in Aboriginal communities, so that they could eliminate their dependence on welfare and build a sustainable future. Right? And the Kelowna Accord, think for a moment, is unprecedented for many reasons, but for this one important reason. For the very first time in our history, 14 jurisdictions, every government in the land said yes to a plan. Right? The other feature that's unprecedented is the First Nations plan. We designed it, working with government. It took us 18 months to design the plan that became the Kelowna Accord. 1,000 people were engaged in the process. It had real outcomes and real targets, and it was cast aside. Right? It was cast aside. And as a result, we've fallen even further behind. Right? It was designed to close the gap in the quality of life between Canadians and Aboriginal people. We would have closed the gap in education, health, and housing, for example, and it would have set the stage for real economic development to take place. And so, instead of just 30,000 First Nation students in university, within that 10-year period, you'd have had close to 90,000. Right? Instead of an 80,000 unit backlog in quality housing for First Nations, in 10 years we would have eliminated that backlog. And instead of having every mom that ready to give birth in the northeastern part of my province, Manitoba, where you have 4 communities with 10,000 people, every mom that gives birth or is has to be flown out to Winnipeg. So think for a moment the disruption in the family, in the community, and the cost of doing that. Because we don't have birthing facilities, we have nursing stations where the janitor or a teacher or the nurse provides, the x-ray services. I remember I raised this issue, and it's an ethical issue, very much an ethical issue, with the then minister I won't name the minister, said, look, here's the situation. We have x-rays being taken by non-certified technicians. And he said, well, I've been told by my officials that they take very good pictures. Right? And I said, okay, I concede that they do. So let's strike up a deal. We will have an exchange program with the Health Science Center in Winnipeg. We will send you our X-ray technicians, right, work in the Health Science Center, and you'll send us those ones to our communities. Right? You think I had a taker for that deal? Not on your life, right? So you think for a moment, how unfair, right? How unfair, but that's our existence. Right? Or too often, that's our existence, to be fair. And so, even though some of the problems I outlined in the beginning of my talk, and I qualified my point about that, can seem overwhelming. We've been working very hard to try and solve these problems for a very long time. And there are excellent ideas that already exist. They only need support to be implemented. The need is for all Canadians to see that our common future is contained in these solutions, our common future. We should not have to engage in countrywide demonstrations in order to have a sustainable future. We shouldn't have to erect blockades. We shouldn't have to lie down on railroad tracks at minus 30. Right? And my fear is that in the absence of collaboration, true collaboration towards sustainability for all of us, we will see increasing evidence of grassroots movements based on ideas of revolution and frustration. I completely support grassroots voices, but I feel sadness that our people would have to resort to such measures to have their voices heard. We want in many ways the same futures that you all imagine for yourselves and your children and grandchildren, future generations. So, to conclude, where do Aboriginal rights fit into all of this? Is the doctrine of Aboriginal rights an ethical doctrine? For many years, Aboriginal rights went unheeded in Canada. Then First Nations began to fight back, and they have used the courts to do this. In the early 70s, it began with the Calder case, where the existence of Aboriginal title was affirmed. Within a decade, the Constitution of Canada had been repatriated, and within it, enshrined Aboriginal rights protections in the form of Section 35. This section of the Constitution of 1982 explains that Aboriginal and treaty rights are recognized and affirmed. About a decade after that, the Supreme Court of Canada explained how governments were to ensure that these rights were not impacted. They did this in the Sparrow case. This was in 1990. Since that time, there have been dozens of cases trying to clarify the duties of both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal governments in the protection and implementation of Indigenous rights. In almost all cases, First Nations assert that Canadian governments are not properly consulting with them as governments go about their business. For example, many of the cases deal with governments giving out licenses or permits related to resource development interests, even though this resource development might have a significant impact or effect on Aboriginal rights. This is not a proper approach, nor can it be seen in any way to be ethical. And since the creation of Section 35, governments cannot engage in this kind of impactful, and I would argue, unethical behavior. This, as Bill Gallagher recently wrote in his book, Resource Rulers, First Nations are winning their battles in court. However, this comes at a great cost. First Nations do not have the resources to spare on battles such as these. I'm optimistic that First Nations rights will play an important role in achieving sustainability in Canada. We need our rights to be implemented, and respected in order to build strong, vibrant, sustainable communities. We need the limitations of the Indian Act to be eliminated. And as a nation, we need to listen to what the Supreme Court of Canada is saying in all these cases. Fundamentally, the Supreme Court of Canada focuses in all Aboriginal rights cases on the idea of reconciliation. In a very famous quote from the Delgamuth case, Chief Justice Antonio Lemire instead urged the parties to negotiate, reminding all governments, let's face it, we are all here to stay. The Supreme Court of Canada focuses on reconciliation because they are of the view that a negotiated, respectful solution is the only way everyone's interests can be meaningfully addressed. The Supreme Court of Canada has been very clear with all of us. The underlying purpose of Section 85 is to reconcile the sovereignty of the Crown with the reality of Indigenous nations, the original self-governing peoples of this land. We can only achieve reconciliation between our Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments if these governments are committed to having meaningful discussions, honest and open negotiations, and to create solutions that we can all abide by. First Nations, as self-governing nations, have always had a say in what happens in their territories, and they will continue to do so. The question we all face is, will we hold our governments accountable to ensure this happens in a peaceful, negotiated manner? Will it be in a more forced way through legal action, or in a more revolutionary way through grassroots movements? We have an opportunity placed before us by the Supreme Court of Canada. We also have that opportunity because we know inside that the right path, the just and true path for all Canadians, the path to reconciliation, is to address the deplorable situations that I outlined in my talk here this afternoon. Reconciliation will be achieved if Indigenous peoples and the rights of our peoples are fully implemented. And responsibilities of these citizens, our citizens, all of Canadians, have safety, healthy, vibrant places that they can call home. Reconciliation can only be achieved when First Nations receive a fair share of environmentally respectful economic development that occurs in their territories. Responsible development, not development at all costs. And this is something that our President and CEO, Gordon Nixon, has spoken about in the past many times. Responsible development. And that's an obligation that falls on all our shoulders, right? All Canadians. However, we must do this together, to pick up on my point, so that we can formulate a just solution that respects environmental limits and natural and the Creator's law. First Nations have significant legal power. However, I believe the Supreme Court of Canada has given us, as Canadians, all the tools we need to implement their messages. We cannot rely on the courts always for change. This we must do ourselves. This responsibility is on our shoulders. We need to create the kind of positive change that Canada needs. And we can only achieve this by working together, by being open, by reaching out to each other in a respectful way. And if we commit ourselves to that approach, Canada will become even better than it's been. Canada will finally be able to achieve true justice for all its peoples. And that's our common challenge. Thank you very much. Thank you.
My name is Jody Clark, and I'm the Academic Dean at Atlantic School of Theology. First of all, thank you. Brilliant. Well done. Years ago, I went on a spiritual retreat, and the monk who led the retreat looked out at all of us, and I know a lot of you in the room, and I know you're all really, really busy, and I know how hectic your lives are, and he looked out at us, we all was on spiritual retreat, and he said exactly that to us. He said, you know, you're all very, very busy people, and you have so much on your plate. He said, what I want to suggest to you is don't read any more good books. And then he sat there for about 10 minutes, and he didn't say another thing. And then he looked out at us, and he said, you're all too busy to read good books. Stop reading good books. 10 more minutes passed. He looked at us one more time, and he said, you're all too busy to read good books. Read only excellent books. Now, he saved me probably $20,000, $30,000 because I pick a book up and I look at it and I say, is this a good book or is it an excellent book? The other thing, I've appropriated that idea, that notion, and brought it into my own life. And I get to hear a lot of speakers, and I try to choose to go to only excellent speakers. There are three kinds of speakers in my experience. The first kind are the kind of speakers who are very funny, and I appreciate them, but as soon as it's over, and I maybe have a new joke. The second kind of speaker is a speaker that I really like because I get to nap. The third kind of speaker is an excellent speaker, and they have the capacity to do what Phil did today. He was able to be disturbing. I found it disturbing, and at times I found you overwhelming. But I also leave today feeling a sense of optimism and hope. Years ago, I had the honor of hearing Desmond Tutu speak, and he actually did make the correlation between apartheid and the residential school system. And at the end of the talk, he was asked about justice and the north-south realities and the black-white realities, and he said, he was asked about justice, how will you find justice in the midst of all this? And he smiled and he looked out at us and he said, you know what you should all do? Come home to Africa. And what he invited us to do, I think, was to think of ourselves as one great village, as one great people. And last night I heard you say that as well. A few of us had a chance to be with Mr. Fontaine last night. But at the end of your talk today, I heard you say that too, that what we really need to be is a country where we are one people, where the pain and suffering of First Nations people belong to all of us. And it's not simply something that belongs to someone out there, but in fact affects our souls and our beings and how and who we define ourselves as Canadians. I think you poignantly did that today, so thank you so very much for that. I would like to thank you, too, for coming to our annual CCEPA lecture. I'd also like to thank RBC and Kim for a wonderful introduction, for their generous support in both providing access to Phil for this talk and its financial support to today's event. I'd also like to thank my employer, Atlantic School of Theology, and St. Mary's University, and Dr. Colin Dodds is here today too, representing St. Mary's, for their ongoing support of CCEPA as co-founders of the center. I'd like to thank our many guests, many people who took time out of their day today to be here with us today, and also thank the young Canadians for coming today. I hope that you were moved and that you will be a part of finding a solution to the many problems that face our country, and that we do that together as a community. There are a couple of housekeeping notes just before we sum up. There are evaluation forms on the table. We take those very seriously. I know some organizations don't. We do. And so please fill them out, and they'll help guide and direct our programming in the future. Finally, and again to Phil, thank you so much for your generosity, your time, your wisdom, and most especially your humanity. Thank you.